When you picture the Pope, what comes to mind? A holy man in white robes blessing the faithful from a balcony. A symbol of peace and divine authority. Now forget everything you just imagined. Because the medieval papacy was not about holiness. It was about power. It was about politics. And sometimes it was about turning the Vatican into a stage for the most scandalous drama Europe had ever seen. What if I told you that one pope gambled away church funds during papal audiences? What if I told you another pope sold the papacy like a piece of real estate? And what if I told you that one pope actually put his predecessor on trial? Not after his death. His corpse. Yes, you heard that right. A rotting corpse propped up on a throne and accused of crimes. This is the true story of the popes who turned the holiest office in Christendom into a soap opera. And trust me, the writers could not have made this up. If you love history that reads like a scandalous novel, then you have come to the right place. Subscribe to The Calm Historian and hit that bell so you never miss a story. And if you are enjoying this journey, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us step into a world where the men who wore the crown of St. Peter often behaved like king's gangsters and occasionally complete lunatics. Pope John XII was not a priest when he took the throne of St. Peter. He was not a theologian. He was not even particularly interested in God. Octavian, the son of a powerful Roman noble, became pope at the age of 18 because his family owned the city and the cardinals knew exactly who paid their salaries. The year was 955 and the papacy had just become a family business. John XII did not see himself as the vicar of Christ. He saw himself as a Roman prince with a very impressive title and an unlimited expense account. The Lateran Palace, which should have been a house of prayer, became something else entirely. It became a pleasure palace. It became a gambling den. It became a place where the line between sin and sacrament disappeared completely. John gambled. He gambled constantly. He gambled during papal audiences while pilgrims waited for blessings. He gambled with church funds that should have fed the poor. He gambled so openly that chroniclers wrote about it with horror. But gambling was just the beginning. John XII also drank. He drank excessively. He drank with noblemen and courtesans, and whoever else happened to be in the palace. He held wild banquets where the wine flowed like water, and the conversation drifted further from holiness than anyone thought possible. And then there were the women. John kept a rotating cast of mistresses, some of whom were married, some of whom were nuns, some of whom were likely just trying to deliver bread and left with regrets and rosaries. He turned the papal residence into something resembling a very disorganized bachelor party. One chronicler accused him of living like a pagan. Another compared him to Caligula. The Holy Father had become a playboy with a tiara. But John did not limit his scandals to pleasure. He was also violently ambitious. He once had a man's eyes gouged out for political reasons. Another man's tongue was allegedly cut out for speaking against him. He raised armies and lost them. He begged the German Emperor Otto to come help him, then betrayed Otto the moment his back was turned. John played both sides and lost both sides. His reign ended in 964. He died of a stroke while in bed with a married woman. Some say God struck him down. Others say the woman's husband caught up with him. Either way, the man who treated the papacy like a personal amusement park had finally run out of luck. And yet his story is not the only scandal. It is not even the worst. Because if you think John XII was bad, wait until you meet the Pope who sold the papacy like a used carriage. That is Benedict IX, and his story is even more shocking. If you thought one scandalous pope was enough, think again, because Benedict IX makes John XII look like a choir boy. Benedict became pope in the year 1032. He was about 20 years old. Some historians say he was even younger. Either way, he was far too young to lead a global religion, especially when his hobbies included orgies, bribes, and wielding church authority like a child with a flamethrower. Benedict did not inherit the papacy because he was holy. He inherited it because his family, the Counts of Tusculum, had been running Rome for decades. They placed him on the throne like a puppet. But Benedict had no interest in being a puppet. He wanted to enjoy himself, and enjoy himself he did. His behavior was so appalling that chroniclers began running out of words for disgraceful. One wrote that his life was a feast on the sins of the flesh. Another accused him of simony, extortion, and bringing wild animals into the papal palace. Whether those animals were literal or metaphorical is unclear, which somehow makes it worse. What we do know is that Benedict turned the Vatican into a playground. He hosted parties that would have shocked even the most jaded Roman noble. He took mistresses openly. He drank excessively. He treated the Holy Office like a license to do whatever he wanted. And the people of Rome eventually had enough. In 1044, an uprising forced Benedict out of the city. He was deposed. A new pope was installed. Problem solved. Except Benedict came back. He returned to Rome with an army and reclaimed the papacy because of course he did. Then he did something so audacious that historians still shake their heads in disbelief. He sold the papacy. Yes, he sold it like a used carriage. Benedict approached his godfather, a man named Gregory, and said, "How would you like to be pope?" Gregory, presumably thinking this was a fantastic idea, paid Benedict a massive sum of gold. Benedict stepped down. Gregory became Pope Gregory VI. Everyone went home. Except Benedict changed his mind. He came back again. In 1047, he barged back into Rome, declared that the sale was null and void, and reclaimed the throne. Now you had two popes, both claiming legitimacy. The church panicked. The emperor intervened. Finally, Benedict was exiled, permanently excommunicated, and banished into obscurity. But let us not forget why he sold the papacy in the first place. According to some accounts, Benedict wanted to get married. There was a woman he fancied, and he believed stepping down would impress her. A romantic gesture, yes. A theologically horrifying one also, yes. It did not work. The woman declined his offer, likely because her dowry did not include lifelong public shame. Benedict, humiliated and still single, then tried to take the papacy back. Not for love anymore, but out of sheer papal spite. Benedict IX remains the only man in history to sell the papal throne like a piece of real estate. He proves that sometimes the most scandalous sin is not lust or greed. It is treating the highest office in Christendom like a summer job. And if you think selling the papacy was bad, wait until you hear about the time a pope dug up his predecessor and put the rotting corpse on trial. That is the cadaver synod, and it is one of the most bizarre moments in church history. Now we arrive at one of the most bizarre episodes in all of church history. A moment so surreal, so macabre that it feels like a fever dream. But it really happened. In the year 897, Pope Stephen VI had a problem. His predecessor, Pope Formosus, had been dead for nearly a year. But Stephen was still furious with him. Formosus had committed the unforgivable sin of becoming pope when Stephen's faction did not want him to. And Stephen never let a grudge die. So he decided to do something that no one in history had ever done before. He put a corpse on trial. Stephen had Formosus's rotting body dug up from its grave. He dressed the decaying remains in full papal vestments. And then he propped the corpse up on a throne inside the Lateran Basilica. This was no quiet private ceremony. This was a public spectacle. The rotting body of a former pope sat upright before a full assembly of cardinals, bishops, and clergy. Stephen appointed a deacon to act as defense counsel for the corpse. Yes, someone had to argue on behalf of a rotting skeleton while keeping a straight face. The charges were serious. Formosus stood accused of illegally ascending to the papacy. He was accused of violating canon law. He was essentially accused of being pope when Stephen thought he should not have been. And Formosus, understandably quiet throughout, was found guilty. His papal garments were torn off. 3 of his blessing fingers were cut off. And his body was thrown into the Tiber River like a very unholy log. But here is where the story twists. Shockingly, not everyone thought this was a reasonable use of church resources. The spectacle caused widespread outrage. Bishops were appalled. The general public, who had seen their fair share of ecclesiastical weirdness, finally drew the line at corpse prosecution. Riots broke out in Rome. The faithful were horrified. And Stephen VI, the brilliant mastermind behind this entire affair, found himself in prison shortly after. He was strangled to death by unknown hands. Though to be fair, there were probably several volunteers. The cadaver synod remains one of the most infamous moments in papal history. Not because it changed doctrine, but because it reveals something deeply human. Absolute power unchecked by accountability eventually turns absurd. It turns cruel. It turns a holy office into a theater of vengeance. And when the powerful lose their grip on reality, they do not just harm the living. They reach beyond the grave to punish enemies who can no longer defend themselves. But the church did not learn its lesson. Because if you think putting a corpse on trial was bad, wait until you hear about the time the papacy abandoned Rome entirely for 70 years. The Avignon papacy turned the Vatican into a ghost town and the French crown into a puppet master. After the chaos of the Cadaver Synod, the papacy limped forward, but it never truly recovered its dignity. The scandals kept coming, but nothing prepared Christendom for the day the Pope simply left. In the year 1309, Pope Clement V made a decision that would change the course of church history. He packed his robes, his cardinals, and his gold, and moved the entire papal court from Rome to the sleepy French town of Avignon. Rome was dangerous, he said. Too much violence. Too much chaos. And to be fair, he was not wrong. Rome was a battlefield of feuding noble families. But Avignon just so happened to be under heavy French influence. And somehow, every pope elected during this period just so happened to be French. What a miraculous coincidence. The Avignon papacy, as it came to be known, was not a temporary arrangement. It lasted 70 years. 70 years of French popes living in French luxury far from the tombs of St. Peter. The papal palace in Avignon was more Versailles than Vatican. Banquets, silks, tapestries, and private chefs turned the Holy See into a playground for the elite. One pope reportedly spent more on spices than on alms for the poor. You could argue he was seasoning souls, but the people of Rome were not laughing. They watched their ancient city lose its spiritual heart. They watched pilgrims pass through empty streets. They watched the Vatican fall into ruin while the Pope sipped wine in the south of France. Pilgrims stared at the empty windows of St. Peter's Basilica and whispered, "Is anyone home?" But the popes in Avignon were not in a hurry to return. Why trade French comfort for Roman chaos? Avignon had better plumbing, fewer mobs, and actual cheese courses. The church's image took a hit. Critics began calling it the Babylonian captivity of the church, a harsh comparison to the exile of Israel. But when your holiest office is operating out of a French wine region, people notice. The faithful grew restless. Kings grew skeptical. And the cardinals grew fat on French hospitality. Still, the popes refused to leave. They had built a palace. They had established a court. They had convinced themselves that Avignon was the new center of Christendom. And Rome could wait. But the cracks were forming. Italian nobles fumed. The Roman mob grew louder. And the church's enemies began to whisper that the Pope had become a French puppet. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI finally bowed to pressure. He returned to Rome. But nearly 7 decades of absenteeism had transformed the papacy from a Roman institution into a cross-continental circus. The damage was done. And just when things seemed to settle, the church made everything worse. Because if you think one French pope was bad, wait until you hear about the time there were 3 popes at once. The Western Schism turned Christendom into a theological battlefield, and salvation itself became a matter of geographic convenience. And just when it seemed the papacy could not sink any lower, the church decided to prove everyone wrong. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome. The Avignon exile was over. The faithful breathed a collective sigh of relief. For about 5 minutes. Then Gregory died. The Roman mob demanded an Italian pope. They shouted for a Roman. They threatened the cardinals with torches and pitchforks. The cardinals, many of them French, panicked and quickly elected Urban VI an Italian. Problem solved. The mob was satisfied. The church had a pope in Rome. But Urban turned out to be a disaster. He was difficult. He was angry. He scolded the cardinals, refused to compromise, and accused people of plotting against him, which in fairness they eventually did. The cardinals regretted their decision almost immediately. They declared the election invalid. They claimed mob pressure had forced their hand. And they elected a new pope, Clement VII. Clement set up shop not in Rome, but back in Avignon. And just like that, the Western Schism began. Now there were 2 popes, both claiming legitimacy, both excommunicating each other with great passion and zero self-awareness. It was like a very expensive divorce. But instead of splitting property, they split Christendom. Kings had to pick sides. France, Scotland, and Spain backed Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy stuck with Rome. Bishops were confused. Parishioners were baffled. And salvation itself began to feel like a matter of geographic convenience. If you lived in England, you followed the Roman Pope. If you lived in France, you followed the Avignon Pope. If you were a merchant traveling between the two, you had to decide which pope to obey and which one might send you to hell. It was chaos. It was absurd. It was a theological nightmare that lasted for decades. But naturally, the church found a way to make things worse. In 1409, a council in Pisa tried to resolve the issue. They fired both popes. They declared both illegitimate. and they elected a third pope, Alexander V. But neither of the original popes stepped down. They refused. They dug in their heels. So now for a brief and glorious moment in history, the Catholic Church had three popes. Each claimed to be the only legitimate one. Each excommunicated the others. And all three refused to share the holy hat. Imagine the confusion. Imagine the faithful trying to pray when every church in town had a different pope to follow. It was not just a schism. It was a circus. Finally, in 1417, the Council of Constance got serious. They deposed all three claimants. They pressured them to step aside, and they elected Pope Martin V. The schism was over, but the damage was done. The papacy had been humiliated. The church had been exposed as a political game, and the faithful had seen the holy office reduced to a brawl between power-hungry men. And if you thought three popes was the peak of absurdity, wait until you meet the Borgias. Because the family that took over the Vatican in 1492 made the Western Schism look like a quiet prayer meeting. And now we arrive at the family that made every previous scandal look like a church picnic. The Borgias. In 1492, Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI. He did not win the papacy through prayer or piety. He won it through the most aggressive bribery campaign in church history. Cardinals received palaces, gold, and promises of power in exchange for their votes. It was less an election and more an ecclesiastical auction. And once installed, Alexander treated the Vatican like a combination of mafia headquarters and family estate. Because the Borgias were not just a family. They were a dynasty. They were a crime syndicate with papal approval. And they had no shame about any of it. Alexander openly acknowledged his children. He had several, but the two most famous were Cesare and Lucrezia. For a pope sworn to celibacy, this was a bold move. Rather than hiding his illegitimate kids, he promoted them. Cesare became a cardinal at 18. He wore the red robes, but he had no interest in the priesthood. He preferred armor. He preferred warfare. He preferred eliminating rivals. When his brother Giovanni died under mysterious circumstances, everyone looked at Cesare. The Pope did not seem overly upset. Shortly after Cesare resigned from the cardinalate, he switched careers from cleric to mercenary commander. Think holy man to hitman in under a month. Funded by church gold and backed by his father, Cesare carved a path through central Italy, conquering cities and eliminating anyone who stood in his way. He became the prince of warfare. He became the terror of the peninsula. He became everything a pope should never be. And then there was Lucrezia. History has been cruel to her and confused about her. Depending on the source, she was either a brilliant political pawn or a scheming poisoner. The truth is likely somewhere in between. She married 3 times. Not for love, but for alliances. Her first husband was annulled. Her second was mysteriously murdered. Cesare again. Big maybe. And her third stuck around long enough for Lucrezia to become Duchess of Ferrara and a genuine patron of the arts. But the rumors never stopped. Incest. Poison rings. Secret lovers hidden under Vatican trapdoors. Historians now believe much of this was political smear. Enemies of the Borgias could not beat them with swords, so they tried slander instead. But when you are the daughter of a pope and your brother is building a private army, it is hard to stay scandal-free. Together, Lucrezia and Cesare became the most infamous siblings in Renaissance history. Brilliant, dangerous, and photogenic in fresco. They blurred the line between royal family and organized crime. And through it all, Pope Alexander looked on proudly like a father at a school play where everyone is accidentally stabbed by Act 2. He died in 1503, likely of malaria, or poison, or karma. Reports vary, but his legacy is unmistakable. He is the ultimate reminder that in the Renaissance, even the Pope could be a warlord in robes. A family man with a side of scandal and absolutely no shame. The Borgias are the climax of our story. They are the peak of papal corruption. And after them, nothing would ever be the same.